Slightly annoyed, I looked over at Benny, who was sitting comfortably at the small wooden table next to the window and was now devouring his fourth piece of toast with jam. "Come on, we're leaving soon and you're not even dressed yet," I urged him. He rolled his eyes and stood up calmed. Barely a minute after he disappeared into the bathroom, he came out again. Instead of his gray sweatpants, he was now wearing brown shorts, and he had finally put on a t-shirt. Tada said with a grin and started putting his shoes on. The corners of my mouth twitched upwards against my will. He noticed and smiled triumphantly. "I'll put our backpacks in the car and you'll quickly eat something. Then we'll set off." "Okay." I nodded and dropped 2 slices of bread into the toaster. While I waited, I looked around the hotel room. It was nicely decorated and had a cozy atmosphere, even though it was quite small. We arrived late last night and chose the cheapest room because we wanted to leave early the next day. I think back to that morning often. It was late spring almost 2 years ago. We had been looking forward to this trip for months. Benny's father was originally from Tennessee and Benny had long wanted to visit the town where he grew up. Since the area is rich in national parks full of mountain views and forests that we love, it seemed like the perfect destination for our next hiking vacation. I was shocked when my toast finally popped out of the toaster. I quickly smeared the slice with butter, jam, and ran out to where our rental car was parked. "Can we go?" I asked impatiently. It wasn't until we arrived at the national park early and parked the car in the parking lot that I began to relax. The sun was shining. There were only a few white clouds in the sky, and the dense forest around us had something exciting but also calming about it. After just a few meters of the hike, we were surrounded by wood all around. The trees were large and their lush green crowns seemed like warm bundles snuggled together. Rays of sunlight fell on us through the leaves. The air was fresh, but noticeably cooler than up in the parking lot. For the first while, we barely spoke. The path wasn't particularly wide and we had to walk one behind the other. Each in our own thoughts, we just enjoyed the wild nature around us. It must have been over 2 hours, and although we were still surrounded by forest, the ambience felt different now. The tree trunks were closer together, and the treetops barely allowed any sunlight to reach the ground. The terrain was steeper, and behind the thick bushes we could occasionally see overgrown rock faces. Although I was warm, I felt that the temperature had dropped. An almost uneasy feeling came over me, and I was grateful that Benny was here. I would have felt much less comfortable alone. Why was I such a scaredy cat? Suddenly, Benny stopped abruptly. He excitedly pointed into the middle of the bushes. "What's up?" I asked, shocked. "Please, no bear," it flashed through my head. "There's a big cave behind the rocks. We'll take a closer look at it," he said, and took a few steps towards it. Startled, I grabbed his arm. "We should not deviate from the path. What if we can't find our way back? It's not far away. I just want to take a quick look and then we'll just move on. But you can also wait here," he said, and gently tore himself away. I didn't move. I wasn't comfortable leaving the designated path, but the thought of standing there all alone was no less unsettling. "Wait a minute," I shouted and started, fighting behind Benny through the bushes and branches. Shortly afterwards, when we stood directly in front of the big dent in the rock, I immediately felt uneasy. I chalked it up to my discomfort at leaving the path and tried to shake it off. Benny obviously didn't feel that way. No. On the contrary, he looked thrilled. "Look how huge that is. It's even bigger back there," he realized as he rummaged through his backpack. I had to admit, it was pretty impressive. The cave seemed deep because you could barely see the end in the darkness. "You probably won't go in there." Or, I said in shock, "Why not? It is more than big enough, and who knows what there is to discover there." Grinned Benny, I just thought. He knew I was scared. "Come on, let's just take a quick look around, and then we'll move on." I hesitantly walked through the entrance, but I didn't murmur to White Oak. We were immediately surrounded by humid air and a rain-like smell. The interior of the cave felt smaller than it looked. Although the rocks were bright on the outside, the walls inside had a dark blue-black color like cool. "There's a second room going on," he prompted me. To my disappointment, things actually continued at the back. I shook my head violently. "You are stupid," I whispered, outraged. "This is really going too far. Come on, let's get out of here." But Benny was already on his way deeper into the mouth of the cave. With my flashlight still in my backpack, I had no choice but to stay behind in the dark or follow him. In the second room, it was a floor window. Our light suddenly seemed dimmer. Perhaps it was the enormous size of this back cave. The floor was irregular and sloped inwards. From "Wow," Benny breathed. A deep, louder sounding echo shook the room. I felt sick as mild panic set in. I already hated this cave. Okay, enough scene. I want to come outside again. I was already begging. Benny looked at me. I could barely see his features, but I knew he looked disappointed. Please, I'll add one more. Okay, I'll just take a quick look around the corner. And then we'll go, he said soothingly, but it had the opposite effect. Tears gathered in my eyes from sheer frustration. I tried to protest briefly, but quickly gave in. We slowly made our way down towards the end of the room. I could see a large hole sitting not far from the ground that looked like a passageway to another chamber. The ground was uneven and slippery in some places. Although it wasn't steep, the dip made the gene even more difficult. The edges of the hole were decorated with large cobwebs and appeared almost sharp, with sharp stones sticking out irregularly. It wasn't particularly big, but a child could easily fit through it. However, I would never in my life stick my head into it. Benny bent down and let his flashlight slide through the opening. Although I wanted nothing more than to be outside in the sunlight again, I couldn't contain my curiosity either. What do you see? I didn't ask much. I think my battery is running low, he told me angrily. He pulled the lamp out again, and it glowed just as before. Benny muttered strangely and shook it a few times before putting it back in the hole. Suddenly, he pulled his arm out again, as if he had been burned on a stove. What the heck, he asked in shock. I wanted to investigate what he had seen, but a big lump in my throat stopped me. It was pitch black, damn it, Benny suddenly cried out loud. I dropped my flashlight, he explained to me in a stressed voice. I felt him bend down and search the floor with his arms. Minutes passed. Maybe you want to help, he snapped at me. I could hear that he was scared now too. The darkness was simply overwhelming. It felt like an eternity as we sat silently next to each other on the floor, helplessly searching for the lamp with our hands. Every little stone I touched gave me a fright. My imagination was working against me and coming up with all sorts of horrible scenarios where I lost my hands in the dark. Venice emphasizes loudly. The inhalation snapped me out of the horror of my thoughts. Come on, he said firmly, pulling me to my feet. He gripped my arm tighter than necessary and shook me slightly. It sounded more like a statement when he asked, "We're just feeling our way in the dark now. Getting out of here." Okay, no, nothing was okay, but I also knew I didn't really have a choice. I nodded hesitantly, even though Benny couldn't see it. Close to you, we turned around and began to climb back up along the slippery floor. The slope was the only thing that helped us know which direction to go. We slowly made our way forward with our hands and feet. My heart was beating like crazy and I could hear Benny's rapid breathing. What worried me even more was that he was also clearly uncomfortable. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something glowing to my right. I tensely turned my head in that direction, but I couldn't see anything until they suddenly appeared again. A pair of bright green-yellow eyes. I froze, feeling ice cold and boiling, hot at the same time. I tried to draw Benny's attention to his eyes in a whisper. My voice shook the couple. Eyes disappeared for a moment, and then reappeared directly in front of us at the end of the chamber, as if to block the exit. Her glow shone. However, Krell in the dark cave wasn't bright enough to illuminate our surroundings. I felt Benny freeze next to me too. Instinctively, I reached for him. He briefly explained bats or something, but didn't sound particularly convinced. The eyes quickly disappeared again. Here he called out in a low voice and frantically dragged me behind him. He began to rush towards the spot from where menacing eyes had just been looking at us. Suddenly they appeared next to us. Then another couple on the other side. Then another and another above us and several behind us. She slowly came towards us from all sides. Benny now wrote in a determined voice. I don't know how I even managed to move my legs. My body seemed almost paralyzed with fear, as if my brain and body were two separate mechanisms. I must have stepped into a crack in the ground because the next thing I felt was a sudden pain in my ankle as it twisted as I fell. Then my shoulder hitting the cold stone floor hard. I screamed and was frightened by the loud echo that filled the entire room a second later. To my horror, I saw a pair of eyes coming straight towards me. I wanted to kick them, but all I managed was another scream. The moment Benny grabbed me, I felt something cold on my leg, as if someone had stuck an egg pack at me. I shook my leg and managed to get myself onto all fours. Half under my own power and half dragged by Benny, I finally reached the exit to the first part of the cave. It was still far too dark for my taste, but bright enough to be able to see anything without a flashlight. This chamber seemed like a paradise. There were no eyes to be seen here either. Without pausing, we stood up and ran across the grotto out into the forest. We raced like savages through the dense undergrowth, jumping over large roots and ducking under large sticks. Benny ahead. He had no intention of stopping. My lungs were burning, I had stitches in my side, and my heart was beating so fast in panic that it felt hot. The branches seemed to be everywhere, hitting me from all sides, while the ground seemed to be throwing thorns and nettles at me. Maybe it was several minutes, maybe it was just a few seconds. It seemed endless. Stop. Stop. I gasped. Tears welled up in my eyes. Stop. I huffed again, louder this time. Finally, Benny stopped. For a moment, we both just stood there, trying to calm our breathing. I felt dizzy and fell weakly to the ground. Only now did the pulsating pain in my right ankle penetrate my consciousness. My shoulder also hurt, and I could feel a big bruise soon forming on my hip. Panted Benny. I replied indignantly. He asked about the time, but then I also realized that dusk had fallen around us. The forest was now bathed in an eerie dark blue that seemed to slowly eat away the friendly-looking green. It must have been late morning when we entered the cave against my will. There was no way we had spent more than half an hour in this chamber of secrets. What's going on here? I whined. They weren't bats. Benny. He looked at me for an answer, but only slowly shook his head. We need to find the trail before it gets too dark. Looks like we'll have a little night hike back to the car. He tried to joke in front of us, but I didn't feel like it at all. I even felt a little angry. What the hell is that supposed to mean, Benny? Why did you have to go into that stupid cave? That exactly why you shouldn't leave the path, that's what I blurt out. My ankle hurts like hell. I don't even know if I can walk properly. Why did we just leave our phones in the car? Then he looked around and then grumbled in agreement. Shit. Yes, he could say that out loud. I can support you because we have no choice. I think we came from that direction. Then the path must also be in this direction. His words didn't sound inviting, but he was right. We had no choice. I carefully stood up and put my arm around his shoulders. We began to limp through the forest. I don't think any of us were really sure we were going anywhere near the right direction. Night fell quickly, and it wasn't long before we needed my flashlight to make our way through the thicket. Can we take a break? I asked when I couldn't bear the pain in my foot anymore. We sat down on an old tree trunk. Then he excitedly shouted, "Look, Malalina, back there." He pointed to a tree with a blue plastic arrow attached to it. I gasped in relief. Blue arrows marked the parking lot on our hiking trail. I immediately forgot about my injury. Blue's my new favorite color. I breathed a sigh of relief. Benny gave me an encouraging smile. We began to march through the bushes again. When we reached the path, we stopped for a moment. From here, it was still several hours to the parking lot. It was dark and cool outside, and our strength was slowly waning. I suddenly heard a rustling in the forest behind us. Startled, I turned around and saw a pair of glowing yellow eyes. Benny screamed indignantly. The eyes stared at us for a moment, then began to move rapidly towards us. I could make out no body, no shape to which the eyes could belong. We began to run along the path like startled deer. My swollen ankle made it difficult to walk, and I kept falling back. Benny tried to stay with me, but fear kept driving him forward. In addition to the first pair, a second and third pair of eyes had now appeared. We could also see the evil-looking lights running behind us to our side. Soon we were almost surrounded by them, with eyes in front of us and behind us. The only way out was back into the forest. With no real alternative, this was the route Benny took, and I was forced to follow him. The eyes also followed us. We could hear the bushes rustling where they appeared. The branches creaked above us as pairs of eyes moved through the treetops. I ran like crazy with my right arm limping heavily behind me. I could still feel the pain, but it felt muted. In general, my legs felt kind of numb and lifeless, but still functioned perfectly. I thought it was funny whether Benny was feeling the same as when he was rooted to the spot, so I stopped. "Benny," Benny shouted. I am unsettled by only tree trunks and bushes in the dark forest around me. An icy shiver ran down my spine. The unpleasant mix of adrenaline and panic made my sweaty palms tremble, and I could feel a cold pallor creeping out from beneath the strained flush of my cheeks. What could stay here, but I couldn't go anywhere. Out of sheer hopelessness, I screamed loudly for Benny again, but all I got back was my own quiet echo. Slowly, very slowly, I began to put one foot in front of the other. Without any plan, I crept anxiously through the bushes. My leg hurt, and now not only was my ankle swollen, but my shin was also red and had a hot, itchy rash on it. I tried to convince myself that it was coming from one of the many plants I had already run through today. But in the back of my mind, I knew that the trail came from whatever had touched me so coldly in the cave. Suddenly, I heard a rustling in the bushes again. I jumped and immediately stopped dead in my tracks. A bear. A wolf, perhaps, the creature that includes the menacing pair of glowing yellow eyes that have haunted us since the cave. I stared tensely in the direction the sound came from, ready to run again at any moment. But only a disturbed-looking Benny emerged from the thicket. For a second, we just stared at each other. When the initial shock wore off, I took a big leap forward to hug him, but he backed away frantically. Then he turned and ran. I no longer understood the world. If he didn't see me or didn't recognize me, I would scream after him as loudly as I could. But I received no response. Just before I lost sight of him, I reflexively started chasing him. I had to catch up with him. I wasn't far behind him, but he ignored my calls. Even when he turned around as he was running and our eyes met, he made no move to stop. Had he gone crazy? Maybe he hit his head. Unlike me, he no longer had a flashlight, and even with my flashlight, it was difficult to see what was in front of me. Wherever we were exactly, the forest here was extremely dense, far away from any hiking trails. Nature was unchanged, and showed no consideration for us little, helpless people. Benny was now running much slower. He climbed disoriented through bushes and roots. I got closer to him. Soon I would catch up with him, but just before I did, he was suddenly gone. A shattering scream took over the forest. The next moment there was dead silence again, then a second scream, this time longer, this time from my mouth. Directly in front of me, as if out of nowhere, its deep gorge opened up. I almost fell, but managed to find my balance at the last moment and hold on to one of the thin trunks on the edge of the steep slope. When I stopped abruptly, my backpack almost flew off my shoulders. I barely grabbed him, but dropped my flashlight in the process. The light went out as she hit the canyon floor with a dull thud. But I didn't have time to be angry about it. Benny had fallen down the slope. I had to find him as quickly as possible and help him. He was probably seriously injured, or even no. I didn't want to think about it. Full of adrenaline, I started running along the cliff to find a place where I could get down safely. I found a section that looked less steep and was also overgrown with thick roots, my only option. I carefully shimmied my way down the almost vertical wall. Since there were no tall trees growing in the canyon, the moon gave me enough light to see my surroundings. The further I climbed down, the louder the sound of raging water became, until it was the only noise I could hear. Once I got to the ground, it took me a few seconds to orient myself. A not particularly large but raging river made its way through the stony landscape. I ignored the urge to drink from it, and instead ran towards the exact spot where Benny must have crashed. Exasperated, I ran around, searching zigzags everywhere for his body, but no trace. After an eternity, I was sweating wetly, and the thirsty, burning sensation in my throat became unbearable. I stopped and took a deep breath. I couldn't continue like this. I needed some kind of plan. As I walked towards the river, completely out of breath, thoughts raced through my head. What if I couldn't find him? What if I found him and he was dead? Maybe he never fell, but what if he did fall but didn't hurt himself and just kept running? Why did he even run away from me? What had I done to him? Tears welled up in my eyes again, but I didn't want to cry. I had to keep a clear head. Full of pain, I knelt at a point in the river where it widened at the strings and the water almost stood still. I already wanted to slap a load of the cool liquid on my face. Then I stopped. Because from the reflection of the river, two yellow-green shining eyes simply stared at me. Startled, I fell backwards and crawled backwards a few meters. I looked around but couldn't see any other couples. Were these creatures also in the water? I must have imagined it. They were probably just stars. I looked up at the sky, and yes, indeed, the dark canvas was dotted with many bright stars. Convinced, I moved back to shore. But as soon as I put my head above the water, those eyes looked at me again. They followed my every movement perfectly, almost like a reflection, as if they were my own eyes. Minutes must have passed as I stared at myself. Well, at least these eyes, my eyes. According to my reflection, I didn't have a body. I was the only one who insisted, and from the glare of my eyes alone, I was now one of them. Instinctively, I grabbed my leg, which I heated up through the rash. I had driven Benny into the slope. Without knowing it, he was the cause of his panic. Where had he disappeared to now? Salty tears streamed down my face. I could still feel it, but I couldn't see any of it. Even as I wiped the tears from my cheeks, I felt the warm skin and could see and feel my arms and legs. But in my reflection, I no longer existed. I hopelessly buried my head in my arms and collapsed on wine. When I calmed down and my head was like the hop, the dawn was about to break. I was cold, my stomach knotted painfully, and even though I had drunk, my thirst felt barely quenched. In the now slightly brighter light, I looked around, but Benny was still far and wide and couldn't be seen. He had probably kept walking, I thought, and was relieved that at least I hadn't found him dead. There probably weren't many ways out of the gorge, so I decided to use my last bit of hope to look for an exit. I dragged myself downstream for a while. The landscape quickly became flatter and the river soon turned into the forest. Since I had no other plan, I followed it. The sun rose and gave the trees around me a warm color. Birds began to chirp, and for the first time since we started the hike, the atmosphere seemed harmless, almost beautiful. Suddenly I heard a noise that didn't come from the river. This had now subsided into a small stream and had died down to a gentle, quiet stream. No, the new noise came in bursts, as if it could be cars passing me at irregular intervals, a little far away. Then it occurred to me, was this possible? With newfound enthusiasm, I stepped up my pace and limped towards the noise. Then I saw it was a wide country road that ran through the middle of the forest. It probably led to one of the hiking parking lots. Then a car, unaware of it, drove right past me and disappeared as quickly as it appeared. I excitedly ran towards the street. It no longer bothered me that I was burning myself on nettles and scratching myself on thorn bushes. When I reached the edge of the asphalt, I sank to my knees in relief. I started crying again, but this time from joy. I could see another vehicle in the distance, but my mind was barely there when it came to a stop next to me. A sudden dizziness came over me and everything around me seemed muted. People got out of the car and started talking to me. A second car stopped and more hikers came over to us. I couldn't hear them, let alone understand what they were saying. The events passed as if in slow motion, and at the same time an ambulance was traveling at breakneck speed. I was placed on a lounger, rocking and shaking while driving. I remember arriving to a room painted warm white. Then I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, I felt much better. My head kicked, a little sore, and also my ankle was throbbing, but my senses seemed normal. I was lying in a hospital bed with an IV in my arm and a heart rate monitor on my finger. Next to me was another bed in which an old woman was being cared for by a friendly-looking nurse. When the nurse noticed me looking at her, she smiled good morning. Alina sounded her harmonious voice over to me. She briefly left the room, came back, and then turned her attention to the old woman again. "The doctor is coming soon," she explained, as I obviously looked confused. A young-looking doctor in a green blouse over which she wore a long doctor's coat entered the room. After introducing herself and taking a look at my stats, she asked me with a skeptical expression, "What else do you remember?" I didn't even know where to start, what was what. With my eyes, I wanted to know instead. The doctor frowned. "Her eyes are fine." "Do it because you can see well?" she asked. I called the glow. Stunned. These people were about blind. The doctor and nurse looked at each other worriedly. Before either of them could ask another stupid question, the words were spilling out of me. I told about the cave to the eyes before it, how Benny had run away from me and fallen into the ravine, how I had turned into nothing more than two glowing eyes. Alina. The doctor started gently. She and her friend Benny got lost during their hike. The search for you took almost 3 days. My mini-neon froze for 3 days. When they were found by passing cars, they were dehydrated and hungry. You also had a wound on your head, she continued. I touched my forehead, and yes, I felt a bandage encircling my entire head. Do you remember hitting your head, she asked. I shook my head, unsure. The doctor continued. So you really don't remember anything about your eyes? I started down the gorge, but immediately stopped again. What happened to Benny? I hardly dared to ask. Unfortunately, you haven't found it yet. But I'm sure the search parties are doing their best, she informed me compassionately. After our conversation, I was still not entirely convinced that my version of events was just a hallucination. But when Benny's lifeless body was found in a ravine the next day, I realized that perhaps all the terrible experiences were just the result of a severe concussion. It was my tip that had led the search parties to scour the canyons. Apparently, that was the only reason they found him. But I couldn't be happy about that because in my memory, it was only my fault that he was down there in the first place. But what did he change? Already. The next few months flew by and I hardly know what happened during that time. Except for Benis's funeral, many visits to the doctor, and a few appointments with a therapist, everything seemed pretty meaningless. I still find it hard to believe that I imagined it all. But what was and what is crazy will probably remain a secret of the forest forever.